For our science lesson for today, we will continue our discussion of Darwin's theory of the descent of man.
Bertram Cates, I hereby place you under arrest.
Is this just a scene from an old movie? Or can teaching science still make a teacher an outlaw? Biology, the Bible, and the First Amendment. That's today's topic.
This is Freedom Speaks with moderator Carrie Brock.
And hello again. Welcome back to Freedom Speaks. Today, a law to punish teachers who tell their students about evolution. Sounds like an idea straight out of the 1920s. But in at least one state, a lot of people still think it's a good idea.
In a natural selection context, what is it that's going on for that?
Wesley Roberts is a science teacher in Nashville, Tennessee, a man who makes evolution a major topic of discussion in the classroom.
The theory of evolution is considered to be the organizing principle of biology. What do you end up with?
But recently, Roberts' ability to teach was put to the test.
2 Corinthians 5:16. If anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation.
In 1996, Tennessee lawmakers spent a lot of time talking about evolution. In fact, several state senators wanted a law to fire teachers who taught evolution as fact. Others wanted schools to teach creationism.
If students feel like that they're overgrown monkeys, or that's the way they evolved instead in the image of God, that has a lot to do with their self-worth, their self-esteem.
The American Civil Liberties Union says politicians imposing their own religious views in public schools is wrong.
The beauty of the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause is to ensure that government not be involved in promoting particular religious beliefs.
We have rights too. People that believe in God and believe that man was created in the image of God, we have a few rights, and this is a very small step.
This is history remade.
In 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, science teacher John Scopes was arrested for teaching that man evolved from apes.
Have you ever pondered what would actually happen to the earth if the sun stood still?
His arrest led to the infamous monkey trial, as depicted in the film Inherit the Wind, with famed lawyers of the day William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow debating the Bible and science.
Or don't you believe in natural law, Mr. Brady? Would you ban Copernicus from the classroom along with Charles Darwin? Would you pass a law throwing out all scientific knowledge since Joshua?
The important thing is to recognize that this is an issue that keeps coming back and coming back. And in fact, we've spoke about this most recent effort as Son of Scopes.
Ayes 13, nays 20.
Rejected.
In 1996, Tennessee state legislators eventually voted against the bill that would have fired teachers who push evolution as fact. Still, many, like Wesley Roberts, fear damage has been done.
I think I'm one of the few teachers in this area, and maybe even in the South, that teaches the theory of evolution, especially as thoroughly as I try to do.
The goal of the bill was to intimidate teachers so they would not teach evolution at all.
Our panel now is set to debate this issue today, including first Dr. Steve Meyer of the Discovery Institute, who thinks it's okay to teach alternatives to evolution in school. Dr. Eugenie Scott from the National Center for Science Education disagrees with that. Also with us today, Elliot Mintzberg of People for the American Way and Charles Haynes of the First Amendment Center. Dr. Meyer, let's go to you first. Why do we keep fighting about this?
Well, it's a very involved issue, and it's not quite as simple as the Scopes trial stereotype that we often see. I think the problem with this Tennessee law that's on the books is that it doesn't really address the real problems in biology education.
Which are?
Well, if you look at any of the major textbooks, take the biology textbook by Miller and Levine, 700,000 copies in print. It has two main problems. One is what it doesn't tell, and one is what it tells. Let me just say something about what
So you think it should tell creationism?
No, yeah. Well, I don't want to get to that yet, because the words creation and evolution can be defined variously, and we need to cover some ground first. I think the main problem, the issue is posed as science versus religion, but I think the main problem is a selective presentation of the science in the major textbooks and an ideological agenda that comes out in the teaching of that. Let me use this textbook as an example. In the Miller-Levine book, you have no mention of what is arguably the most important event in the history of life, the Cambrian explosion. Now, the Cambrian explosion is often called the biological Big Bang. You get a sudden...
Yes, the Big Bang Theory, yes, we know.
Not the Big Bang of the universe, but the Big Bang of life, where you get a sudden emergence of lots of different organisms. It's an anomaly, something difficult for neo-Darwinists to explain, and it doesn't find any mention in the major textbooks. But what you do find in the Miller-Levine text is statements to the effect that life came about through an entirely purposeless process, that it's random and undirected.
Now, we need to get the other panelists in on this. What's your response to what you said?
Well, the textbooks that I've looked at do consider the Cambrian explosion, not to get too deep into the specifics of science, but the Cambrian explosion is a perfectly normal part of evolutionary history. I mean, this is not a big secret that we're trying to hide.
And you believe that it is fine to assume through the theory of evolution that it's happened randomly and without a purpose?
No. This is where Steve and I can agree. I think we would both agree that ideology and religion and philosophical views should be kept out of the science classroom. I would not want to see fundamentalist Christianity like the clips that we saw opening up your show. The idea that everything was created all at one time and that this should be presented as an alternative to evolution. But I also don't think that the idea of materialist philosophy, that there is absolutely no possibility of any kind of supernatural influence on the natural world, should be presented in a science class. I think the science class should be neutral.
And Carrie, I think that goes back in some ways to your original question, why do we keep fighting about this? After all, the Pope recently said that he thinks that evolution is perfectly consistent with deep religious faith, and I think a lot of religious people believe that. But one of the reasons we keep fighting about it is that there are folks, sometimes called the religious right, use whatever phrase you want to, that are insistent on the notion of injecting their religious views into the science classroom and into many classrooms beyond that.
That's one of the things that's just emerged in this early conversation. And I'm going to push you a little bit on that, because isn't it true that people on the other side fail to see, when they have philosophical or worldview presuppositions built into how they teach evolutionary theory, how the textbooks treat it? So, for example, I don't know whether this is a good example for you to respond to, Eugenie, but isn't it the case that Carl Sagan's statement that he made about the universe is all there ever was, all there is, and all there ever will be, is allowed in to high school textbooks and discussions, but explicitly religious statements are kept out. So if we're going to have a level playing field, don't we have to be a little more careful about how we bring philosophical presuppositions to this discussion?
I think there's an important principle of religious neutrality in this whole debate, which is being violated by the present way in which biology is taught.
By
the textbooks themselves. If you go through this, we can provide people examples in literature on this at the Discovery Institute on the World Wide Web, but the individual textbooks, Ayala has statements to the effect that natural selection made God as an explanation for the obvious design of organisms irrelevant.
Without going through all the individual textbooks, that's where you have the greatest beef, and you're disagreeing.
My concern is that too often we see it the other way around. My favorite recent example was in 1996, when in Kentucky, literally science textbooks were called back, and the superintendent glued together the 2 pages that talk about the Big Bang Theory.
I'm not going to let you steal my thunder on that one, because that's a great example, and we have a bit of video on that right now. So let me go to that so our audience can better understand what you've just mentioned. The Big Bang Theory is a bust as far as one Kentucky school superintendent is concerned. And here's what he did, as you mentioned, to make sure that his students didn't even read about it. In Kentucky, a school superintendent did not want 5th and 6th graders to learn about the Big Bang theory of the formation of the universe. So he ordered that certain pages of the science textbook be glued shut.
How do you highlight a textbook with only one theory of our creation, of our existence, and not be allowed to probably work with the other side of that?
But not all parents and educators agreed with such measures.
I'm outraged. I believe that as a public school system, that we as parents and we as taxpayers deserve the right to have our children learn what the rest of the state of Kentucky is learning.
Can anyone here defend? Can you defend what that superintendent did?
Well, I kind of like the Big Bang Theory myself. As a theist, I think it has theistic implications, so I think it was a misguided attempt to shield students. I want to say something about the
emblematic of the desperation, however, that we're seeing in public schools.
And Steve's point is very well taken. There is nothing about the Big Bang Theory that is inconsistent with the religious point of view. Indeed, the pages of that textbook itself even said that it's only a theory, that we're not even sure if it happened.
But Ellie, there's a lot of confusion. Science teachers don't understand these distinctions that Eugenie was making earlier about materialist philosophy versus other kinds of philosophical presuppositions. Because of this politicized debate, my view is that science classrooms across the country, pages glued together is one example. On the other side, people are afraid to mention evolution, people are afraid to mention there's a controversy. The approaches we've taken, I think, on both sides, frankly, are not working if we're talking about good science education.
Charles,
we've got to open up the science classroom to better discussion of what are the issues behind these controversies. It's just not there.
I do have to disagree with the notion that the typical science classroom is anti-religious, which is really what you suggested.
But it's shutting down the conversation so that people are teaching science in a more dogmatic and way rather than opening up to philosophy of science, history of science.
One of the problems here is that we don't realize that we're not just talking, we tend to think of science as just the facts and religion as something utterly different. And most of the times that's true, but there are issues like the origins issue where science and religion necessarily interact, and there are religious implications, theological, philosophical implications that people naturally draw from these theories. And if we're going to present the materialist case, then we need to present the opposite case.
Okay, now I can agree that there are textbooks, and I've dealt with this in my own work, and you know we've had some exchanges on this before, that there are some scientists, Sagan is one, Will Provine is another, who do present science as if it were something that completely replaces any possibility of the supernatural. That's materialism or naturalism as a philosophy. That doesn't belong in the science classroom. But I think what happens in a lot of the textbooks and where teachers may make a mistake, and particularly scientists might make a mistake, is confusing different levels of causation. When you look at the history of life, when you look at descent with modification, you look at biological evolution, you can explain the changes that take place with natural process. You don't have to use supernatural cause. Okay, that was the whole business about what Darwinian natural selection and the neo-Darwinism and the other scientific theories can do. You can explain without having to resort to the supernatural. That doesn't mean you have to, and that doesn't mean that rules out the possibility of a theistic
that itself is not a religiously neutral proposition. The idea that nature itself is capable of creating. This is where you get the idea that it's undirected. This is Darwinism. Darwinism has an important philosophical implication, which is that nature is sufficient. And there are people who dispute that, scientists who dispute this. Michael Behe's new book, Darwin's Black Box, is an elegant case for design based on the micro-technology, the nanotechnology in the cell.
If you look at
now, that kind of evidence cannot be heard in the science classroom, though there are many scientists who are very excited about this point of view.
But the concern that I have, I work with parents and teachers all across the country that are not at the collegiate and doctoral level that these two very prominent scientists are at, but are worried about what their kids are learning in elementary school and high school. And what's happened is not what Charles is talking about, but exactly the opposite. People have been scared off from talking about evolution because of all of the concern, as in Kentucky, as in Tennessee, in places like that, with the result of which that kids who are taking the AP biology exam are not knowing about, let me finish this, about 25% of what's on the AP exam has to do with evolution.
Then, Elliot, why not teach the controversy? I agree with you that you have to teach the prevailing views in science. We want scientific literacy. It's a compelling interest of the society. We want good science taught, and I'm for that. I'm suggesting a strategy toward that end, better than the one we have now, would be to have some place in the curriculum, science curriculum also, where we teach the controversy, let students in on the fact.
And I would say as long as it's teaching about the controversy,
that's right,
whether
we're not doing that.
I mean, my own view is
but
that
Elliot,
let me just finish. It works a little bit better, I think, in a social studies classroom than in a science classroom because of what kids at that level are used to doing. But whatever the name of the classroom, it has to be clear that you're teaching about the different philosophical views in the same way that you would never advocate actually preaching Christianity or Buddhism, but but teaching about those different religions.
Yes.
That's perfectly fine.
And that's where we need to do some work.
But that is not
happening.
what the legislators in Tennessee or the superintendent in Kentucky wanted to do. They wanted to impose a religious orthodoxy, and that's not only bad science, it's also unconstitutional.
But I want to talk about bad science, because in the textbooks you have a very selective presentation of the evidence. There is hardly a mention of the very difficult empirical objections that are being raised against neo-Darwinism in the top scientific literature. If you look right across the subdisciplines of biology, from genetics to developmental biology, these problems are discussed openly. The problem of the origin of new structure, the origin of information. Recent articles said Darwinism explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It does not explain the origin of the central thing that needs to be explained, which is new structure in biological systems. That is openly acknowledged in the top scientific literature, but it nowhere percolates into our science texts, and students
Please
are given...
weigh in on this,
Steve, I'm sorry, I just have to disagree with you. This is not a big debate in the scientific world. Michael Behe's book has been reviewed by a large number of scientists who are working in the areas in which he's claiming to have expertise, and the book has been panned.
What about teaching both evolution and creationism in the schools?
You can teach about, like Elliot was saying, you can teach about Buddhism, you can teach about any religious view. You cannot advocate special creation as an equally valid scientific view or as an equally valid view.
But with people, Charles, with such polar opposites in this argument, how do we convince them you can teach about both of these?
Well, people have been told you have to choose.
Well, that's right. We have to get out of the politics
nonsense.
and back to the education. The First Amendment issues are fairly settled. We know we can't impose religion in public schools, and I would hope that none of us here, and most folks, are not arguing for that. There are some who do argue for that. So let's get beyond that and get to the educational issues. And if, in my mind, the First Amendment means anything in this issue, it means fairness. It means working, neutrality under the First Amendment, means working for fairness in the curriculum. So we've got to get people together on all sides and say, where can we teach these controversies? Where can we uncover some of the philosophical presuppositions in how we teach science? Social studies is one place, obviously, to teach various religious views. But of course, teaching about religious views or philosophical presuppositions in the history of science, philosophy of science, is perfectly appropriate. The new national standards for science says we need more history of science. So in other words, Carrie, we need to recover a common ground position among people on all sides on how we can get more worldviews in the conversation without undermining the science curriculum.
But the problem is that you can't...
This is where Steve and I would disagree.
Yeah, and I think that's right, but my only concern about what Charles said, with which I agree as I understand it, is that some people interpret a statement like his to mean, well, that means that creationism and evolution have to be on, quote, equal footing in the science classroom because it's fair, and that's not right, because
well,
evolution...
Yet again, you've given me an entree into a bit of video.
There we go.
Because this has been tested before, and we want to give folks an idea of where. The question is, what's wrong with giving evolution and creationism equal time? Well, one state tried that more than 10 years ago, and the legal battle that followed ended up all the way to the Supreme Court. In the early 1980s, Louisiana passed a law that said if you taught evolution in science class, you also had to give equal time to creationism. That is, the idea that man was created by God as written in the Bible.
We feel that children have the right to hear all the information.
But the creationism law never went into effect.
You would be doing science the first half and then undoing the scientific process the second half of the hour.
The Supreme Court ruled the law was unconstitutional because it violated the separation of church and state.
Hooray for the Bill of Rights. It's a wonderful decision.
I think what the court has ruled, in effect, is that God is unconstitutional in the classrooms of our country.
All right, so where does all this leave us?
What you should teach in the science class at the K-12 level, kindergarten 12 level, is the consensus scientific view. The idea that there are alternatives to evolution, that design theory or scientific creationism, all of these euphemisms for alternatives.
If my child doesn't like what you're teaching, if my child thinks you're leaning toward evolution a little more than creationism, can my child get up and walk out of your class?
Depends on the state. We're very decentralized in education. But what we should, how we decide the curriculum should be based upon what the consensus scientific view is. And the notion that there are scientific alternatives to evolution has been looked at. the arguments of the
Yes,
creation scientists.
yes.
There must be 20 books and I don't know how many hundreds of articles that have looked at the arguments of creation science. Now this new kid on the block, design theory, that's being looked at. That's being found to have a lot of the same problems because it's really just a restatement. We have to teach the consensus view.
May I respond to this?
Yes.
There's a different, I agree that the students need to know what the consensus of scientific opinion is, but there's a difference between what scientists can prove and what they believe. And it is true that the majority of scientists have an evolutionary worldview. But whether or not they can establish that, you have a raft of technical articles admitting the central problems have not been solved by neo-Darwinism. You don't have to look far to find these, and these problems do not make
You've neo-Darwinism about 12 times, and I'm going to have to ask you, in one sentence, define neo-Darwinism.
That's the modern version of Darwin's theory, the theory that we have come about through random mutation and natural selection.
Is the problem, Elliot, that scientists do not see creationists as particularly intelligent? There is sort of this idea that creationists are ignorant, and that leads to a lot of the disassociation.
There may be some people, but I don't think that's the problem. I mean, the gentleman from the Institute for Creation Research, his organization is described by itself as a Christ-centered ministry for promoting a religious view, and that is ultimately what the Supreme Court said that creationism is, and you can't teach that in science class in the same way you teach evolution. You can teach about it, as Charles says. You can talk about different competing philosophical views. As I said before, the Pope says that evolution is perfectly consistent with a deep religious view. But you can't treat evolution and creationism as two alternatives that get equal time, and the Supreme Court said the reason for that is because doing that is promoting religion.
Well, we can go back and forth, and we have for many years, and be polarized on this and get nowhere, and it hurts science education, this debate, in my view. We've got to find a better way. One thing that people who are critical of public schools, both people who want others, what they claim to be scientific critiques of the prevailing view in there, and people who want religious views in the public schools somewhere taught, can be accommodated. As you've just pointed out, we're not doing it. We're not preparing teachers to understand this controversy. We're not saying, here's philosophy of science, where science comes from, where history of science. The standards call for more of this, but we're not doing it. We also, in the social studies, are not teaching about various religious ways of thinking, So religious people get more and more backed into a corner thinking only one worldview is allowed in the public schools. We're not allowed in the public schools.
Wait. If you don't promote religion, that doesn't mean you're promoting secularism.
No, but absence of any other way of seeing the world, religious or philosophical, speaks hostility to many people who feel left out of the conversation.
I'm an anthropologist by training. I think comparative religion is great. I think we are theologically illiterate just as we're scientifically illiterate.
That's a condescending take on the issue, because the science itself raises the philosophical issue. And the Darwinists, Ayala, Fatuma, they're all extremely clear about this. I respect them for their honesty. But if they can talk about the evidence that supports the idea that the universe is purposeless, or that
this is what
then we ought to be able to talk about the evidence for the opposite.
These are problems in understanding levels of causation. As a philosopher, I think you understand that better than probably most of us.
Well, I don't agree with that.
Where they would make some mistake is by saying, okay, let's take this notion that Darwinism suggests that the universe is purposeless. Okay, when a scientist says in a textbook that the evidence that we have is that there is no direction to evolution, that there is no purpose to it, they are making a statement that they mean one thing by, but which a theist is going to hear differently.
And you now have had the last word. Dr. Eugenie Scott, thanks to you. Dr. Charles Haynes, you as well. Dr. Steve Meyer, and our non-doctor today, Elliot Mintzberg. Thank you all. And now it's your turn to express yourself. Eric Hamill saw our program on clothing and free expression, and he writes, all the drug t-shirts display a skull at the center of a marijuana plant. Since when is associating something with death a way of promoting it? A California viewer made a generalized comment about panelists on that same program. Tony Burton writes, what fascinated me was the propensity of panelists to turn to the federal government for solutions. Don't people understand that laws and regulations take away freedoms? We'd like now to hear from you, and there are several ways to get in touch with us, starting with our electronic addresses. Send your email to speak@fac.org. Visit our internet webpage at www.fac.org. Our postal address is Freedom Speaks, 1207 18th Avenue South, Nashville, Tennessee, 37212. And that is our program for today. We'd like now to close with some of your comments about creationism and devolution. And thanks for being with us. See you next week.
I think parents have kind of forgotten about religion, and it's something more important in your life. And I think if they started learning it in school, it would be a topic that we would bring up a little bit more and discuss.
I do not believe creationism should be taught in public schools. I am I guess, pretty much strict constructionist when it comes to the Constitution, and I believe that there really should be separation of church and state.
Part of our history has something to do with religion. Religion is part of history. I don't think you should necessarily teach religion, but I think it's an issue that should be addressed.
I don't mind religion being taught if it is taught in an overall manner, not in a specific, and creational is specific.